It is a notable part of the nature of an aristocratic system that upon occasion, due to the coincidence of lineage, talent, and happenstance, a capable man is elevated to supreme command at the age when his abilities show their first power. Such a man was Gaston de Foix. The thunderbolt of Italy emerged in a flash on the field of battle at the age of 21, a fresh appointment by the French crown, astonished Europe with his abilities, and then hardly an instant later at 22, went to his eternal reward, never knowing the outcome of the battle which would be his final triumph. Who was this great captain, and what were his victories? Today, we explore the world of the Italian Wars, and one of the greatest generals of his age.
Destiny! Destiny! No escaping, that's for me!
For decades already, by 1511, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were in a contest for power the likes of which had never before been seen in Europe. Professional armies of tens of thousands contested Italy with new weapons and tactics. The musket and the cannon had at last entered their maturity, while the pike square remained the undisputed master of the field. This was a radically different kind of warfare than the forefather of its participants had known, both inside the Italian peninsula and without. The modern financial and state organizations available to Louis XII of France, Ferdinand of Spain, and Maximilian of the Empire far and away dwarfed the capacities of rulers just a generation before them, and all were enticed by the wealth and splendor of Italy. All of these great rulers sought to claim a piece for themselves, but the various Italian states were not without their own cards to play. City-states, princes, and pope alike sought to exploit the ever-shifting balance of power between the three great states. Venice, Milan, the Papal State, Florence, Pisa, and others all, both prizes and players, played their part in ever-shifting alliances, decided as much by generals on campaign as by diplomats and statesmen. Into this whirlwind comes our protagonist, the scion of a French noble house with connections to the king himself. Marie of Orleans, his mother, was the sister of the Duke of Orleans, Louis, who was later to inherit the throne of France as Louis XII. Born in 1489, his father Jean died when he was only 11 years old, and he quickly was pressed into the service of the French crown, despite his youth. He was appointed the governor of the Dauphiny in 1503 when he was 14. More a ceremonial position, this was already clear evidence of the favor the young Gaston carried at court. The duties of this position were considerable nonetheless, carrying with them both military and civil administration in a large part of the south of France. He would remain in this office as he grew into adulthood, receiving in the meantime much of his uncle's favor, and it was not long after that he would attain the first laurel of his career, winning praise for his valor during the siege of Genoa in 1508, before he was yet 20. While our protagonist was growing into his duties to the French crown, over the Alps in Italy his uncle Louis of Orleans, now King Louis XII, would be faced with a renewed challenge to his ambitions in the peninsula. The initial onslaught of his predecessor on the French throne, Charles VIII, had astonished an Italian peninsula long used to wars conducted between armies of mercenaries, costly but skilled professionals called condottieri, canny men who, like any professionals, had a tendency to come to professional understandings in preference to fighting when it suited them. Armies were small, and frequently so were the stakes. If any one city gained too much power, the rest of the Italian states would surely form an alliance and cut the offender back down to size. This system became nearly diplomatically formalized generations before in the Peace of Lodi, a treaty which ensured a kind of balance of power between the leading Italian states. Venice, Milan, Naples, and Florence, and the Papal State in addition, all agreed to join the Italic League, or the Holy League, thus ending decades of tumultuous coalitions and wars. But Charles VIII of France shattered this balance irrevocably. As a claimant to the throne of Naples, Charles believed he had every right to march down from the Alps and seize what was his. And what was more, unlike the abortive Italian adventures of other kings, he was determined to make his claim stick. The army Charles brought to Naples in 1494 was a force larger and more capable than anything else seen in Europe in many years, carrying away fresh honors from campaigns against the English at the conclusion of the 100 Years' War, and armed with many large cannon. The armies of Italy scattered at his approach, and Charles made good his claim. The most the Italian states could do was attempt to block his army's return passage north the next year, but they barely managed to slow him up, though they still claimed victory. In spite of Charles' best intentions, his control over Naples proved ephemeral, and so too would his chance of reasserting it, as he died before he had the chance. Departing from watching a game of tennis, he struck his head onto a door lintel, and he shortly thereafter died from hemorrhage. Though Charles had died, his claim yet lived, as did his ambition for French domination of Italy, and his successor, Louis XII, would prove even more determined and longer-lived an opponent. At the same time, other more significant forces than the petty princes of Lombardy became interested in the peninsula. King Ferdinand of newly united Spain also had a claim to the throne of Naples to press, and the newly elected Emperor Maximilian of Austria had no interest in letting a powerful France menace both his holdings in Burgundy and the legitimacy of imperial overlordship in Lombardy at the same time. Years of back-and-forth diplomatic maneuvering resulted at last in the wobbly alliance of the Pope, the Emperor, and the King of Spain, all opposed to France, determined to push Louis out. By this time, Louis XII had taken possession of Milan during the course of his many campaigns in Italy, and the rich surrounding lands and cities of Lombardy. But this new coalition threatened to destabilize everything. The papal armies showed unexpected vigor, led in person by Julius II, who stormed the fortress of Mirandola during a vicious winter campaign at the beginning of 1511, camping so close to the walls that papal servants were slain by the fire of the defenders. The capture of this important fortress town laid open the way for papal and Spanish troops to seize Ferrara and root out the gains so recently made in the north of Italy. Louis knew action was needed immediately. Any further gains could see France's army destroyed and its important bases besieged. With his other generals faltering or perishing, Louis called upon the services of his nephew, the young and valorous Gaston de Foix. Though his initial appointment was to the governorship of Milan, those administrative tasks were reckoned beyond, or perhaps more accurately, besides, his real role, which was to take command over all French forces in Italy and deliver them from a string of demoralizing defeats. His predecessor, the old condottiero Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, had succeeded in renewing some of the French army's spirits, but cautious, like most of his breed, and now in his 71st year, he was unable to drive his soldiers much further. Gaston de Foix assumed command in autumn of 1511, and was nearly immediately beset with crisis on all sides. The ever-fractious Swiss cantons had left French employ, and now themselves menaced Milan. Meanwhile, Pope Julius, with Spanish help, was again gathering his forces in the east, preparing for an advance on Bologna. The French crown, long suffering from the expense of 2 decades of war, furthermore was unwilling to spare funds to replenish the undermanned and underpaid army in Italy. Because the Holy League had managed to secure the distracting assistance of Henry VIII in England, who reckoned that Italy was a bit far for his men to sail, and instead opened a new front in France itself. De Foix, the king decided, would therefore have to make do with what he could muster. The situation with the Swiss, fortunately, could be decided without a fight. Bad weather delayed their advance until the middle of December, and when the Milanese populace proved less riotous against the French than they had hoped, the Swiss went home, starving and mostly empty-handed. Concerning the Holy League itself, however, King Louis's orders were both more explicit and more dramatic. The parsimonious king was unwilling to justify the expense of a protracted campaign when an army had to be raised against the English at home. Only a short one would be acceptable. De Foix was commanded to seek out the enemy and to fight him, to win a decisive battle, and further, to put the Pope down and dictate terms from Rome itself. In the opening days of 1512, the looming Hispano-Papal offensive finally burst forth towards Bologna. Despite the importance of this city, it was held by a shoestring French garrison, incapable of any action other than dispatching for help and hanging on. Gaston set out at once, but not to Bologna, not at first. Instead, he made as if to abandon the city and marched towards besieged Brescia, to confront a Venetian army assembling there at the same time. But this was just a feint. Suddenly he changed directions, and with forced marches through the icy winter weather, came to Bologna. So unexpected was his arrival that he delivered the city from its besiegers virtually unopposed. With the papal forces off balance, de Foix did not rest his troops from their exertions, but drove them on further, now back north. The Venetians had overcome the garrison of Brescia, but de Foix, undeterred, pressed his soldiers onward, 120 miles in 9 days through the biting cold. Upon arriving at that city, de Foix had under his command an army of 12,000, with which to confront the Venetians, who had entered only days before. He attempted to summon the city fathers to surrender and thus spare the place the pains of a siege and, potentially, a sack. The Venetian commander, however, intercepted this letter and would not pass it on. February 18th was the day Gaston de Foix had chosen for his assault on Brescia, and it was a day of pouring, freezing rains. Gaston did not let these conditions deter him from attacking. Rather than let the mud slip him up wearing boots, he took his off and prepared to fight barefoot, and giving his own example, ordered his men to do the same. When the hour of the attack came, de Foix's encouragement had shown its worth, and by midday the city was in the hands of his army, in spite of many casualties. After weeks of exhausting marches and hard fighting, his men were in no mood to be civil to a population which, for all they knew, had rejected the offer of surrender. Gaston was unable to hold them back, and they subjected the city to a terrible sack. But there was still no time to waste for the energetic French captain, with so many other enemies looming. Emperor Maximilian still vacillated between neutrality and joining the fray beside the rest of the League, but the first sight of weakness or even delay might yet entice the Austrian. The joint Papal-Spanish army had withdrawn back towards the city of Ravenna, on Italy's east coast, and despite the atrocious condition of the roads, Gaston de Foix set out in pursuit with a force of 20,000 French, with a few thousand Italian allies, determined to put the Holy League to flight. When he arrived at Ravenna, though the Spanish and Papal troops obviously would wish to buy time, Gaston believed the city was simply too important for them to let him take it unopposed, and so to draw them out, he prepared to besiege it, setting his men to digging trenches and preparing the field for the inevitable battle. Merely days later, his enemy responded exactly as he thought, an army of 16,000 joining the 5,000 already besieged in the city, encamping nearby and preparing their own fortifications. The next day was Easter. Gaston assessed his enemy. Many of his officers had fought the Spanish before and knew of their canny tactics. The French, ever impetuous, would eagerly march out to attack their enemies during a battle as immediately as possible without unnecessary preparations, a fact that the Spanish exploited by fighting from field fortifications, wearing the French down to exhaustion before delivering an attack to put the weary enemy to flight. De Foix decided he would turn the tables on the Spaniards. If they were content to sit still in their trenches and palisades, he would pound them with every gun at his disposal. For 3 hours, the two sides bombarded each other with thunderous cannon fire, a bombardment of a kind never seen before in the annals of warfare. As Gaston worked his gun positions up to catch the Spanish cavalry in a crossfire, he was able to flush them out, causing the Spanish to instead precipitate the battle with an attack. Despite these changed tactics, the Spanish forces and their Papal allies fought with great determination, yet it was clear that the French held the advantage. Soon the grinding contest began to tell, and the Spanish and Papal troops were both disintegrating. It was at last the longed-for victory. But Gaston would never know it. Late in the battle, the thunderbolt of Italy, whose 3-month campaigning season had left Europe awestruck, was struck down at the head of his men, leading his personal cavalry guard, while in pursuit of the fleeing enemy. For the French, the victory came to naught because of the death of Monsieur de Foix, who, for the virtues he possessed, and the hope of greater things to come, was well loved by all his men. It is perhaps the mark of Gaston de Foix's unique talent that without him the French army was unable to follow up on its great victory. So hard fought was the battle that the French army was left in tatters, leaving as much as a third of its strength dead on the field, and without the powerful motivation of their heroically energetic commander, it was to be practically inert after Ravenna, in stark contrast to the vigorous marches between Bologna and Brescia just months before. Indeed, that army under his command so terrified the papacy that when news of the defeat at Ravenna arrived at Rome, Julius II was caught between either accepting peace with Louis XII or fleeing the Eternal City altogether, while a church council convoked in Milan, under French auspices of course, felt emboldened enough to demand his deposition outright. Yet without the drive of young de Foix's fire, no triumphant march on Rome was forthcoming. The succeeding French commander was a less inventive and far more cautious man, unwilling to risk tired forces on such a campaign. Julius, therefore, could rest easy, and the French army, which had stayed dormant for fear of losing its gains, would lose them anyway by excessive caution. Louis XII was devastated by the loss of his dashing nephew. His mourning was so powerful he was said to be utterly inconsolable. The king was heard to say, "Would to God I had never an inch of land in Italy, and my nephew were still alive." Perhaps more dispirited than even his general, Louis ordered the Italian army dispersed as garrisons among the conquered cities, and tried to sue for peace. The wars in Italy would rage on for another generation. Young Gaston's lightning maneuvering and amazing victories earned him a reputation as a soldier, and in one season of his brief life he shook all Europe. The king's young favorite, already fatherless at 11, had proven himself a greater general than men 3 times his age. Yet the bright burning fire was doused after only 3 months. Should he have lived, it's very possible that he could have maintained the cohesion of his army long enough to make the much-feared lunge towards Rome, perhaps even concluding a peace with Julius II that would see French holdings in the north of Italy maintained. But effects beyond this are harder to read. Certainly under so able a general, a lot of the military failures of Louis XII and Francis I's reigns might have been averted, and the eventual Habsburg domination of Italy might well have been prevented. But the political and diplomatic quicksands of the Italian wars frequently turned victors into losers, and vice versa, sometimes in a matter of months, as de Foix was himself an example. His youthful vitality and abilities produced not merely military but also artistic tribute. Soon after his death, a monumental mausoleum for de Foix was commissioned from the workshop of the sculptor Agostino Busti, which, though it was never completed, is still hailed as a landmark of Renaissance statuary. The immensity of his achievement, from assuming command to total victory inside 3 months of campaigning, combined with his seeming preternatural talent for command, have produced for him a reputation compared with Napoleon and the Duke of Turenne. And if he is more obscure than these, it was not for lack of accomplishment. Though his conquests would be eroded, his name will never be diminished.